In the early 1930s, the world was changing faster than the clouds above it. Nations were arming again. Skies were becoming battlefields, and the idea of controlling the air meant controlling the future. Across the Atlantic, tensions rose. Europe was on the edge of another war, and the United States watched carefully, knowing that one day it might be drawn in. The U.S. Army Air Corps needed something new, an aircraft that could reach far, fly high, and strike deep before the enemy even saw it coming. Not just a bomber, but a fortress in the sky, a machine that could defend itself, cross oceans and return home alive. It was an idea ahead of its time, and Boeing was ready to build it. In Seattle, engineers worked day and night under hangar lights, sketching, calculating, dreaming. Their creation would carry 4 engines instead of 2, a radical design that promised power, range, and safety. They called the prototype Model 299. When it rolled out in July 1935, the world had never seen anything like it. Sleek, silver, and massive. It looked less like a bomber and more like a vision of the future. Its first flight proved that vision right. The great machine lifted smoothly from Boeing Field, its engines humming in perfect harmony. Observers on the ground called it a flying battleship. A reporter, overwhelmed by its presence, gave it a name that would never be forgotten: Flying Fortress. But its creation was not just about power, it was about protection. Boeing's designers believed that a well-armed bomber could fly without escort, fight off enemy fighters, and still hit its target. This idea, though later tested in fire, became the core of America's air strategy. The first prototype, however, never saw battle. It crashed during a demonstration flight due to a simple mistake. The control lock left engaged, yet the aircraft's performance had already impressed the Army so deeply that production went ahead. A new series, named Y-1 B-17, was ordered. It was the beginning of a legend, an airplane born from fear of another world war, built to keep it from reaching American shores, and destined to help end it. The Y-1 B-17 marked the first step from dream to reality. It was the first flying fortress built not as a prototype, but as a weapon ready for service. When the first 10 aircraft rolled out of Boeing's Seattle plant in 1937, they carried the lessons of every success and every failure that had come before. Each one was a silver promise that America could command the skies long before it ever entered the Y-1 B-17 introduced innovations that would define an era. It had 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, each delivering powerful thrust and reliability for long missions over ocean and mountain. Its aluminum skin reflected sunlight like polished armor, while its gun positions offered defensive fire in almost every direction. It was the first bomber to integrate a system of internal bomb racks and retractable landing gear, reducing drag and increasing range. This was not just another airplane, it was the birth of strategic air power. In 1938, the Air Corps formally accepted the aircraft and began limited testing and crew training. Pilots soon discovered that the Flying Fortress lived up to its name. It could fly higher and faster than most pursuit planes of the time. It could absorb punishment, lose an engine, and still make it home. Crews trusted it the way soldiers trust armor, because it felt unbreakable. But the path from promise to perfection was not smooth. The first production models, renamed B-17A, arrived with new turbo superchargers that allowed higher altitude performance. They could now fly above 25,000 feet, a staggering number for their time. The A model proved that altitude meant survival. At such heights, enemy fighters struggled to reach them and anti-aircraft fire lost its accuracy. Still, the B-17 was evolving faster than the world around it. When the B-17B followed in 1939, its improvements were subtle but crucial. It gained new engine cowlings for better cooling, a reworked tail for stability, and improved radio and oxygen systems. But its true change came in philosophy. The U.S. Army Air Corps began to imagine the Flying Fortress not as a tactical tool, but as a strategic weapon, a machine that could destroy an enemy's heart without ever crossing a border on foot. This was the dawn of the doctrine that would shape modern warfare. Precision bombing from high altitude. Even before the world plunged into war, the Flying Fortress carried America's belief that control of the air could decide the outcome of any conflict. It was not built for defense. It was built for deterrence, a gleaming symbol of industrial confidence, stretching its wings across a decade that was running out of peace. The world did not yet know it, but the Flying Fortress was about to find its purpose in fire. The B-17 evolved quickly as war approached. Each new version brought lessons learned in testing, training, and in the first sparks of conflict. The C model arrived in 1940, with armor plating added around the cockpit and vital systems. Fuel tanks were now self-sealing, a crucial protection against enemy fire. It was a heavier aircraft, but also a tougher one. Crews who once feared fire in the sky now had a chance to survive it. The D model refined these protections even further. Additional oxygen systems allowed longer high-altitude missions, and improved navigation equipment made it possible to fly in formation through cloud and darkness. Its engines, still temperamental, were strengthened with better cooling and new propellers. Each upgrade was born not from luxury, but from necessity, because the world was sliding into war. By 1941, with Europe already burning, the Flying Fortress was no longer a theory. It was a weapon waiting for its war. Then came the E model, the first truly combat-ready version. Its entire tail section was redesigned with a taller fin and a rear gunner position that finally closed the gap in its defenses. No longer could enemy fighters attack freely from behind. This change, combined with better armor and new twin-gun turrets, turned the fortress from a vulnerable giant into a genuine airborne fortress. The E model also carried new Norden bomb sights, a technological marvel that allowed bombardiers to aim with unprecedented accuracy from 6 miles above the ground. For the first time, destruction could be planned with mathematical precision. When American entry into the war became reality after Pearl Harbor, the B-17E was ready. It crossed oceans, arriving in England under grey skies and enormous expectation. To the British who watched its first missions, it was a strange sight, a massive bomber flying by daylight, unescorted, trusting its own guns to keep it alive. The philosophy was bold and brutal. Precision, not terror, would be America's weapon. Daylight raids would break the enemy's industry piece by piece, until it collapsed under its own weight. The fortress would make that vision possible. But courage and confidence alone could not stop flak and fighters. The E model, though strong, was not invincible. Early missions over France and the Ruhr Valley cost dozens of aircraft. Still, the lessons were learned fast. Crews adjusted formations, overlapping fields of fire so that no blind spot remained. Squadrons became living machines, each bomber covering the next, each gunner watching another's back. The air war was beginning to take shape. Then came the F model, the next evolution of endurance. Its nose was reworked to improve visibility for the bombardier, and its engines received upgrades that pushed performance higher than ever before. More ammunition, more armor, more range. And yet, it still carried the same determination in its frame. The F model was the version that would write its name in history. It flew the most dangerous missions, deep into the heart of Germany, against targets like Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin. These raids tested not just metal, but the human spirit. The losses were horrific. Entire formations vanished in smoke. But those that returned proved the doctrine could work. They showed that the enemy's factories could be struck even in daylight. That precision could be bought at a terrible price. By 1943, the B-17 had become the symbol of Allied endurance. Then came its final and greatest form, the G model. The engineers had listened to every complaint, every desperate field report. They added the famous chin turret under the nose, sealing the last weakness that enemy fighters exploited. With 13 guns pointing in every direction, the B-17G could unleash a wall of fire. It was no longer a target, it was a threat. Inside, systems were simplified for faster maintenance, armor was balanced for weight and safety, Fuel lines rerouted. Controls strengthened. The fortress had reached its final evolution, a perfect balance between power, defense, and survivability. By the end of the war, the sky over Europe was filled with their steady drone, thousands of silver wings in formation, sunlight flashing across them like waves of metal. Factories trembled below, cities burned, and the sound of those engines became the sound of inevitability. The Flying Fortress had done what it was built to do. It had carried the war deep into enemy territory, one mission at a time, until the skies belonged to the Allies. But victory came at a cost that no design could erase. Every hole patched on a returning bomber marked another name missing from the roster. Every empty seat in the debriefing room was a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. The B-17 had proven itself not just as a machine, but as a test of endurance, for the crews, for the engineers, and for the nation that built it. And even as new planes rose to take its place, the sound of its engines would linger in the memory of every man who ever heard them. By the time 1944 arrived, the B-17 Flying Fortress was no longer just an airplane. It was a symbol of persistence carved into the sky. The 8th Air Force had turned the gray. English mornings into vast moving formations of silver wings. Each mission carried hundreds of bombers across the North Sea, through walls of flak and waves of fighters, into the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. They flew through smoke, cloud and fire, and every return was a victory of survival. The B-17 had matured into the backbone of the Allied air campaign. The G model dominated the skies. Its added chin turret gave it the protection earlier crews had begged for. With 1350 caliber guns, it could throw enough lead to carve a path through an attack. From the nose to the tail, it was armored and armed like no other bomber before it. Each fortress carried a crew of 10. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, and 5 gunners. Each man had his job, his ritual, his fears. Inside, the air was cold enough to freeze tears. Frost formed on the glass, and oxygen masks whispered with every breath. Above 25,000 feet, the world turned silent except for the endless roar of the engines, and below, a continent burned. The B-17 was never elegant. It was heavy, loud, and stubborn, built to take damage that would tear lesser aircraft apart. Stories spread through every airbase of fortresses returning home full of holes. Engines gone, rudders shredded, landing on pure willpower. They were more than aircraft. They were survivors. Crews gave their planes names, painted faces and words across the noses. Memphis Belle, 909, Yolda Pub, Hell's Angels. These names became legends, living symbols of courage and endurance. Each mission they flew added a new scar, a new story, and a new memory to the growing myth of the Flying Fortress. In the skies over Berlin, the raids grew larger and deadlier. Thousands of engines thundered together, echoing across the cold air. Flak bursts filled the sky like black blossoms, and German fighters dove head-on into the formations, risking everything to break them apart. But the fortresses held their shape. Their gunners fired until barrels glowed. Red pilots held course through storms of steel. Each man trusted the aircraft and the others around him, a brotherhood built not on orders, but on survival. The escort fighters, the long-range Mustangs, finally arrived to fly alongside them. For the first time, the fortresses had protectors to match their endurance. Together they pushed deeper, striking at oil refineries, munitions plants, and rail networks that fed the German war machine. Every successful raid cut another thread from the enemy's strength. By the spring of 1945, the results were clear. German industry was collapsing. Fuel was scarce. Factories stood silent. The air belonged to the Allies, and the B-17, battered but unbroken, had helped make it happen. Even as victory drew near, the missions did not grow easier. Each flight still meant hours of cold, fear, and loss. Crews knew the statistics. They saw friends fail to return, but they flew anyway, not for glory, for duty, for the belief that ending the war from the sky would save lives on the ground. When the final missions came, the fortresses flew not with triumph, but with exhaustion. They had done their part. They had carried the weight of strategy, hope and grief in equal measure, and when peace finally came, the roar that once filled Europe faded into silence. The Flying Fortress had fulfilled its destiny. It had proven that air power could shape the outcome of a global war. It had turned the promise of the 30s into the power of the 40s, and though newer bombers would follow, none would ever replace the legend of the fortress that brought victory home. By late 1944, the Flying Fortress had become more than just a bomber. It was the instrument through which America waged its most relentless air campaign. Across England's airfields, hundreds of B-17s stood lined in rows, silver wings gleaming under gray skies. They were engines of endurance, built to grind down the enemy city by city, rail by rail, until the will to fight was gone. The war in Europe was reaching its crescendo, and the fortress was its steady drumbeat. Every morning before dawn, the crews gathered in briefing rooms, thick with cigarette smoke and fear. Maps stretched across the walls, red lines tracing routes deep into Germany, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Cologne, Berlin. They memorized headings, altitudes, formations, and emergency fields, knowing well that half of them might never reach those points again. Then came the walk to the plains, long, silent and cold. Engines thundered alive one by one, shaking the ground as dawn broke over the English countryside. Within minutes, entire squadrons lifted into the mist, climbing in slow, deliberate spirals until the sky above Europe filled with thousands of circling fortresses. From the ground, it looked like a silver storm. From the cockpit, it looked like eternity. Every mission was a test of patience, precision, and luck. They faced not only German fighters, but the invisible terror of flak, black explosions that tore through the air with brutal randomness. At 20,000 feet, a man could do everything right and still vanish in an instant. Crews watched planes disappear beside them, one moment solid and alive, the next just fragments tumbling through the clouds. Yet the formations held. Each fortress trusted the one beside it, and together they pushed deeper, mile after mile. The bombing was relentless. Rail networks shattered, oil plants burned for days, factories ground to a halt. The fortress had become a machine not just of destruction, but of exhaustion, a force that drained the enemy's strength day by day. But even as the Allies advanced, the cost was unbearable, casualties mounted, and replacement crews barely had time to learn names before their first missions. In the debriefing tents, silence often spoke louder than the reports. Empty chairs told their own stories. Yet somehow, through all of it, the fortress endured. The G model, with its new turrets, armor, and improved engines, was stronger than ever. It could take punishment that no other aircraft could survive. Some returned with holes large enough to crawl through, wings shredded, engines gone, yet they landed. Each battered plane that made it home became part of the legend, proof that courage and steel could defy gravity and fate together. As 1945 dawned, the skies above Germany belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe, once feared and dominant, was now fractured and exhausted. Fuel shortages grounded many of their squadrons. Young, barely trained pilots flew outdated machines into hopeless odds, and still the fortresses came, filling the air with the steady thunder of their engines. Berlin, once untouchable, now faced the full weight of Allied air power. The missions there were among the most dangerous. The sky so thick with flak it seemed alive. Crews described it as flying through a storm of metal, sound, color, and fear blending into chaos, but they pressed on. Each bomb that fell brought the war closer to its end. Each mission, no matter how costly, carried the belief that the next one might be the last. When victory finally came, there was no celebration in the air, only relief. The fortresses that returned to England on those final missions came home not in triumph, but in silence. They had done their part. They had outlasted the storm. And as the crews stepped down from their planes, many touched the metal skin with a quiet kind of reverence. as if thanking a living companion that had carried them through hell and brought them home again. The war in Europe was ending, but the legend of the Flying Fortress was just beginning. After the war, the B-17 story did not end when the guns fell silent. Many of the silver giants that had crossed the skies of Europe and the Pacific found new lives in a world desperate for peace, but still dependent on the power of flight. The war had proven the fortress's strength, and now that same strength would be turned toward rebuilding and survival. When the military began retiring the older bombers, hundreds of fortresses were stripped of their weapons and repurposed. Some became training aircraft, teaching new generations of pilots how to handle heavy machines in the thin air above 30,000 feet. Others were converted into transports, carrying cargo, mail, and passengers across continents once divided by war. But the most fascinating chapter came when they were reborn for rescue. The B-17 became the B-17 Flying Fortress, a lifeline in the post-war years. Where it had once delivered destruction, it now delivered hope, modified with life rafts, medical supplies, and parachute pods. It was used for air-sea rescue missions across the Atlantic and Pacific. Its new nickname became the Dumbo, after the Disney elephant that could fly, a symbol of mercy instead of might. The sight of a former bomber circling above a downed crew, dropping rafts and supplies into the sea, was a reminder that the same machine that once brought fire could now bring salvation. The transformation was poetic. The warrior turned guardian. Technically, the fortress was aging by the late 1940s. Jet engines were on the rise, and new aircraft like the B-29 and B-50 were faster, stronger, and more efficient. But no new design could erase the affection aviators felt for the old B-17. It was familiar, forgiving, and endlessly reliable. For many, it was the first aircraft they trusted completely. Civilian companies also saw its potential. Stripped of guns and armor, B-17s took on new roles as survey and research platforms. They photographed vast stretches of wilderness, mapped coastlines, tracked hurricanes, and even tested early radar systems. In Alaska, they scouted ice flows. In South America, they carried scientists into jungles. In the Arctic, they flew through storms that would have grounded most aircraft. They had become tools of discovery. Their wartime durability turned toward exploration instead of destruction. Some found new homes in Hollywood. Their distinctive shape and history made them favorites for war. Films in the 1950s and 60s, movies, like 12 O'Clock High, revived their legend for a new generation who had never heard the sound of real engines over Europe. The public rediscovered their story, not as instruments of war, but as symbols of courage and endurance. Meanwhile, a few lucky aircraft escaped the scrapyards and found themselves preserved in museums or kept in flying condition by passionate restorers. Names like Sentimental Journey, Texas Raiders, and Aluminum Overcast became ambassadors of remembrance. They toured air shows across America, their four engines echoing through modern skies like the heartbeat of another century. When those aircraft fly today, people look up not with fear but with reverence. Children cover their ears at the deep rumble. Veterans close their eyes and remember the cold, the fire, the friends they lost. Each takeoff is not a demonstration. It is a resurrection. The Flying Fortress has long since retired from service, but its shadow still crosses every field it once flew over. It remains in textbooks, museums, and the collective memory of a generation that saw the world remade from above. It represents more than technology. It represents resilience, a machine born for war that outlived its purpose and found peace in the skies it once conquered. Its engines may rest now, but the story of the B-17 still hums in the wind, the sound of an era that learned to build giants and then learned to let them sleep. As the years turned and the world entered a new age, the legacy of the Flying Fortress began to change shape. The B-17 was no longer the spearhead of war. It had become the guardian of memory. The same machine that once darkened the skies over Europe and the Pacific now lived on in peace. cared for by those who refused to let its story fade. In the early 1950s, a few surviving fortresses were still working quietly behind the scenes. Some flew reconnaissance over distant territories, taking photographs for mapping missions that stretched from the Arctic to the jungles of South America. Others supported new aviation programs, testing radar and navigation systems that would guide the jet age. A handful even served during the early Cold War as patrol aircraft, their long wings and endurance making them perfect for ocean surveillance. But time was catching up. By the mid-50s, newer aircraft had taken their place, sleek jets that could fly higher, faster, and farther. The piston engines that had once roared like thunder now sounded old, almost gentle. Most fortresses were dismantled or sent to scrapyards, their aluminum melted down and reborn into the skeletons of a new world. Yet not all of them vanished. In hangars across America and Europe, veterans and mechanics began the slow work of resurrection. They scavenged parts from wrecks, polished panels dulled by decades, and coaxed tired engines back to life. It was not for war this time, but for remembrance. By the 1960s, the first restored B-17 took to the skies again. Crowds gathered as it rose into the blue, its engines deep and steady. The same sound that once marked both fear and salvation. For many watching, it was more than an aircraft. It was a memory, a story made of metal and motion. Air shows became its new battlefield, and education its new mission. The Flying Fortress became a moving museum, carrying the voices of those who had flown and fallen with it. Veterans stood beneath its wings, pointing to bullet holes still visible under the silver paint, telling their children and grandchildren, "That's where it hit us, and we still made it home." Each restored aircraft carried a name: Memphis Belle, Sentimental Journey, Shoo Shoo Baby, Texas Raiders. They were no longer tools of destruction. They were symbols of endurance. When they flew, people felt something larger than nostalgia. They felt history itself breathing again. In schools, museums, and documentaries, the fortress became a teacher. It reminded generations born in peace of the cost of the sky they now took for granted. Pilots described how it felt to sit in the nose turret. Glass around you, clouds below, the world suspended between duty and death. They spoke of frost forming on oxygen masks, of engines shaking the bones, of friends who never came back. And as those voices grew older, the aircraft became their messenger, carrying their stories into a century that had never heard real silence after war. By the late 20th century, only a few B-17s remained airworthy. Each flight became a ceremony, slow, deliberate, sacred. When their engines started, people stopped talking. The sound rolled across the ground like distant thunder. Children covered their ears, old men wiped their eyes. It was not a sound of war anymore. It was a heartbeat from the past, reminding the living to remember. Even now in the 21st century, the Flying Fortress still flies in a few skies. Each takeoff is a conversation with history. Each landing, a promise kept. It stands as proof that courage can be built from metal, and memory can have wings. The B-17 story is not one of destruction, but of transformation. Born for war, it lived long enough to teach peace, and as long as one fortress still flies, the echo of that lesson will never fade from the sky. In the modern age, the B-17 lives on not as a weapon, but as a voice of an era when courage was forged in aluminum and steel. Across the world, historians, restorers, and pilots dedicate their lives to keeping that voice alive. Each rivet, each faded insignia, each scar in the fuselage tells a story too vast to be contained in books. The fortress became a time machine, carrying the present back to the moments when the world was balanced on the edge of fire and hope. Today, only a handful of flying fortresses remain in flight. They are cared for like sacred relics, maintained by teams who spend years finding rare parts, rebuilding engines, and painting markings with historical precision. When one of them takes off, it's an event. People travel for miles to hear the deep rolling sound of 4 Wright Cyclone engines lifting the aircraft into the sky. The sound doesn't just reach the ears, it reaches the heart. For those who remember, it brings back faces, names, and moments that no longer exist except in memory. For younger generations, it's the sound of history made real. Every year, these aircraft participate in memorial flights, parades, and educational tours. They visit airfields where once squadrons stood shoulder to shoulder, where runways were lined with bombers ready to rise into war. Now those same airfields echo not with commands, but with applause. The men who flew them are fewer each year, their hair white, their voices soft. When they gather under the wings of the fortress, they do not speak of death or destruction. They speak of unity, of the bond between man and machine that carried them through the impossible. They touch the metal, feeling the cold surface that once shook with life, and whisper words only the plane can hear. They say thank you. In museums, visitors walk through the narrow fuselage and try to imagine what it must have been like. The noise, the cold, the tension. Some stand at the open bomb bay and stare down through the gap, realizing that below such doors once lay cities, oceans, and entire worlds. They emerge changed, not glorifying war, but understanding its weight, because the B-17 was never just about victory, it was about endurance. It was about humanity holding on in the face of destruction, and still finding a way to rise again. The fortress has become a mirror for every generation that looks at it. For the young, it is adventure, the dream of flight, of freedom. For the old, it is memory, the reminder of what was lost and what was saved. For the world, it is a lesson that progress, courage, and compassion must walk together, or the sky itself can become a battlefield again. Even now, when one of the remaining fortresses flies, it carries more than air and fuel. It carries time itself. As it climbs into the clouds, sunlight glinting off its silver wings, there's a moment when past and present blur. For that heartbeat, it is 1943 again, and the world is holding its breath. Then the plane levels. The engines settle into rhythm, and peace returns to the sky. People watch until it fades to a small glimmer. Then nothing. But long after it's gone, the sound lingers. Soft, distant, eternal. Because some machines do more than fly, they remember. And as long as the B-17's shadow crosses the sun, history will never truly be silent. There is a certain poetry in how the story of the Flying Fortress ends. A machine born in urgency, baptized in fire, and matured through sacrifice, now rests as one of the most beloved aircraft ever built. Its wings no longer carry bombs or smoke, but memories. Its engines no longer roar in anger, but in remembrance. Every nut and bolt of the B-17 carries the fingerprints of thousands, engineers, pilots, gunners, and mechanics. All part of a collective act of faith that man could master the sky without losing his soul. In its earliest days, it was just a prototype, a bold gamble by Boeing at a time when America still doubted it would ever need such power. But that gamble became the backbone of Allied victory, from the skies over Germany to the jungles of the Pacific. The fortress proved that technology, discipline, and courage could stand against tyranny. It was not the fastest plane, nor the most agile, but it was the one that came home. It became the embodiment of reliability, the aircraft that could lose an engine, lose a wing, lose half its crew, and still bring the rest safely to the runway. And that, more than any victory, was what made it legendary. After the war, as new generations of aircraft rose, jets with speeds that blurred the horizon, the old B-17 seemed almost primitive. But that illusion fades when you stand beside one. Its frame still hums with purpose. Its presence still commands silence. It represents an age when every takeoff was a question, and every landing a miracle. To historians, it stands as a bridge between the past and the modern world. To the pilots who flew her, she remains a companion, almost alive, a machine that seemed to understand fear, yet never showed it. There are stories of fortresses landing with hundreds of bullet holes, hydraulic systems gone, controls severed, and still finding the ground like a wounded bird that refused to fall. Those who saw such moments never forgot them. In that stubborn will to survive, they saw the reflection of themselves. Even as the decades passed, the bond between men and machine never faded. When veterans meet under the wings of restored B-17s today, their words are few but heavy. They talk about frost on the windows, the smell of oil and gunpowder, the taste of oxygen through a frozen mask. They laugh about small things, coffee spilled in turbulence, the sound of the navigator snoring through his intercom. And then they fall silent, remembering those who never came back. The plane becomes their monument. It carries their ghosts. Each flight today is more than demonstration. It is resurrection. When the engines ignite, it feels as if history itself takes a breath. People lift their eyes, and for a moment, the years collapse. They see not a museum piece, but a living witness, and as the silver wings rise into the blue, the crowd grows quiet, because deep down, they know they are watching something sacred. The B-17 no longer fights, but it still serves. It serves as a reminder of endurance, sacrifice, and unity. It reminds the world that courage does not fade when the noise ends. It becomes the silence that follows. Its shadow crosses fields, cities and oceans that have long since healed. But the echo of its flight remains, and somewhere above the clouds, where sunlight touches the earth for the first time each morning, the spirit of the Flying Fortress still flies, steady, strong, eternal. Because legends do not land, they simply keep going, carried forward by every heart that remembers. When World War II ended, the B-17 Flying Fortress had already written its chapter in history. It had carried the weight of thousands of missions across Europe, struck enemy strongholds, and brought its crews home through fire and chaos. Now, its purpose was changing, from a weapon of war to a witness of peace. After the war, the fortresses were slowly withdrawn from combat. Some were dismantled. Others found new life in service. They became aerial scouts, mapping vast coastlines, charting the polar regions, and taking part in search and rescue missions across distant oceans. What had once delivered destruction now saved lives. The strength that made the B-17 a symbol of war also made it invaluable in peace. Its long range and sturdy frame carried explorers, scientists, and rescuers into places no other aircraft could go. But by the early 1950s, a new era had begun. Faster jet bombers like the B-47 and the mighty B-52 took over the skies, and the old fortress was retired from frontline duty. Yet it never truly disappeared. Some B-17s continued to serve as trainers and research aircraft. While others were preserved in museums, their wings no longer carried bombs. But stories of courage, loss, and endurance. In the decades that followed, these aircraft became symbols of remembrance. When a restored fortress takes flight today, the sound of its four engines is no longer the sound of war, it is the heartbeat of history itself, the B-17. Taught humanity more than tactics or engineering, taught what endurance means, to keep flying when everything else falls apart. It proved that strength is not only in power, but in the will to return home. And so, even in retirement, the Flying Fortress never truly landed. It remains in every museum, every air show, every heart that looks to the sky and remembers. Because legends do not rest. They keep flying,